Before we start writing CSS, it's important to know some of the fundamental concepts. One of the most fundamental concepts of CSS is knowing how the cascade works. The CSS cascade defines the order in which CSS styles are applied, and it determines which styles are assigned to an HTML element based on styles that have cascaded down from other sources. It's what allows us to define styles and keep them consistent throughout a website without having to repeat them in our code. There are three main steps that the cascade follows to determine which properties are assigned to an element: importance, specificity, and source order. Importance depends on the origin of the style sheet, which can come from different sources. One of those sources is the user agent style sheet, which is the CSS a browser applies by default. Each browser has its own user agent style sheet, and this is why there are some visual differences when viewing a web page on different browsers. Another source is the user style sheet, which contains styles set by a user. Users can have special styles predefined that are different from the browser's default styles. These are oftentimes used for accessibility, for people with special needs who, for example, need larger font sizes, specific colors, or contrast. The third source is the author style sheet, which contains the CSS we create to style the HTML page. By default, the CSS and author style sheets have more importance than user agent and user style sheets. Once the cascade decides the importance of a CSS property, the next step assigns the specificity. Specificity determines which CSS styles are applied by the browser. So for example, if two selectors match the same element, the one with the highest specificity takes precedence. Once you're familiar with how specificity works, it can save you time customizing and troubleshooting your CSS. We'll get more in depth with specificity in later videos. The final step the cascade does is determine the source order of a style sheet. The source order is important because the cascade assigns a priority to CSS styles based on what order they appear. For example, if two CSS properties affect the same element, have the same importance and specificity, the one that appears later in the style sheet will be applied. After importance, specificity, and source order have been determined by the cascade, each CSS rule is assigned a weight that determines which property will be applied to an element. In CSS, inheritance means that an HTML element's style values are copied from its parent element. So when a CSS property is said to be inherited, it simply means that the value is determined by that inheritance from its parent. For example, if we set the body element of a page to a specific font color, that font color will be inherited by other text elements, like headings and paragraphs, unless we give them a different font color. CSS rules tell browsers how to render HTML elements. A CSS rule is comprised of two main parts: the selector followed by one or more declarations. The selector is the part of the CSS rule that targets HTML elements. We can use more than one selector in a CSS rule. The declaration is the part of the CSS rule that sits inside the curly braces. One CSS declaration consists of a property name, which indicates the part of the element we want to change, followed by that property's value. As you'll soon learn throughout this deep dive, we can add as many declarations as we want as long as we separate them with a semicolon. So now that we've covered some basic concepts, we're ready to start writing CSS. In the next video, we'll go over the different ways we can apply CSS to a page.